From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien with his weekly grain market segment. He will discuss, as you'd expect, the disruption brought to the markets by the coronavirus outbreak and how you grain producers might capitalize on that in your forward pricing. Dan also looks at the latest economic losses in ethanol production and how well local grain basis has held up in spite of those. Also, K-State's Lucas Haag will take a look at spring wheat as an alternative spring-planted crop here in the Central Plains. He emphasizes that you producers must manage spring wheat for quality as well as yield. And standing by to talk Kansas agricultural weather with us, K-State's Mary Knapp, along with much more right here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. This is Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Welcome to you once more, as we'll pick up on the latest from the grain market beat now. Dan O'Brien joining us, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, and the proverbial elephant in the room, Dan, the coronavirus saga. It is weighing down commodity and financial markets alike. And it's a fluid situation, but this is just ripe for volatility in the trades.
Well, when people don't know what's going to happen and they fear the worst that might happen, they tend to get conservative. That's when they are loath to put their money out on to bid on things. We tend to not buy inventories as much as we used to, and that in the grain market is that slowing down of economic activity really shows. And we've seen not a tremendous drop off in prices, but soybean prices from a month ago are down about 20 cents. Corn prices are just doing so here. Yesterday they were down 6. So we're not dropping to new historic lows at this time, but there's just a lack of enthusiasm. And you combine that with where we normally are in February, heading into March with pretty flat markets, and it just gives us every excuse now to not be aggressive in bidding for these crops. So I guess we'll have to see how all this works out. There's one train of thought that this virus relative to others may not be quite as virulent, and I hear that, but yet the news reports that talk about it are beating a drum for sure, and that increases, like we said, it increases uncertainty and pessimism, scaredness about what can happen, and having an effect on the general economy overall, financials, the stock market, and to some degree also on ag futures. So still a conundrum that we have with the futures just being so-so. We still have tremendous basis levels there. I'm involved with a meeting up in Nebraska in the coming days looking at, and we've been talking about in Kansas how we have pretty strong basis levels. You look up in the Grand Island area, clear separation for corn, a much higher basis than they've had for a good long while, just like down here in Kansas. So you wonder what story that's telling when the futures are just so-so, but yet when you look at the cash basis at local levels, it's really strong. To me, it's indicative of some underlying cash usage of the crop. We shall see. You do ask the question that with all this pessimism in the market and the tendency now for anything to be met with a negative filter, are these buying opportunities?
Right.
And we're not promoting speculation at all, but if you're a cattle feeder or you're a processor of some type, either oil seeds, wheat, or feed grains, these might be great opportunities. You'll still want to protect yourself, of course. And what this is, if you're putting together a marketing plan, is looking down the road and wondering about what type of forward contracting or forward pricing opportunities you might have once we move off into spring planting. There are probably some very, very good buying opportunities to consider for call options, with the idea that if you get to a 4, a 4.30, 4.50 call option, is you paid a few cents for it now. If we do get some type of a move higher in the market, and you reach your quote price goal in the futures, then you'll already have that call option in place. So this is from a grain seller's point of view. So even though the actual price itself isn't very good, in a lot of cases, or at least not as good as farmers are hoping for, still there's some opportunities to piece together a risk management strategy that can make it a lot easier to pull the trigger on forward sales in the coming months if people are willing to look at them.
Well, Dan, with this steady stream of coronavirus news overshadowing many of the fundamentals, the USDA's Outlook Forum numbers from this past week, they certainly have been muted some as far as market reaction, haven't they?
Well, yes. It's as if we looked at them and said, oh, yeah, well, what's the latest rumor on the virus?
Right.
We haven't paid that much attention to them. But there's some pretty important numbers in there. The USDA's acreage figures will probably be the first set of numbers that will, quote, be tested by survey, by actual survey, and not just estimate out of the USDA ERS World Ag Board offices from the chief economist. There's a projection that came out of the Outlook Forum for corn acres to be about 94 million acres. Here, Farm Futures had done a survey, came out yesterday, indicating what farmers had told them at about 96 million, 97 million acres. The soybean number the USDA came out with, it was about 85 million acres to be planted, and the soybean number out of the Farm Futures survey down considerably from that, down at just about 80, 81. So that's a real issue to be wrestled with in terms of where things are going. And you wonder if in that transaction, soybean down almost, about 4.5 and corn being up about 3, how do we balance these differences out from what the USDA numbers are? So there'll be some things to look at, and it's a big report. When we say big in quotes, that's a potential market mover, would be the prospective plannings report that will come out here at the end of March. So that's at least a marker for people to be watchful of in terms of new information coming into the market, and we'll see where things go. There also is this almost forgotten, now it seems, resurvey of late harvested acres up in the northern states. Again, 5 states up through there for corn, 3 for soybeans.
And that has not happened yet. Is that correct?
Has not happened. And 2 months ago we would have thought, well, gosh, coming out of that January report, it's going to be in the March report. That's when it'll be. But the USDA has given no indication yet. If they are going to make that survey, then we'll know, I think, in the next week, because it'll be needing to represent March 1st conditions, and we're almost to March 1st. So we'll see what happens there. If it doesn't happen in March, you would think it would happen in April, but the USDA, in dealing with the odd year that they had last year, has had to take some extraordinary steps to try to represent things accurately. And we'll see when those numbers come. If they do, they hold the potential to shave anywhere from 200 to 500 million bushels of corn, possibly 50 to 100 million bushels of soybeans off of the 2019 crop. It'll affect the in-stocks figure and would have the potential to give some old crop price support as we move on here into spring and early summer. Again, quote, we'll see. Right. I think, though, that so many people have been proven wrong by trying to estimate where these final numbers are going to come out this year, that if anything, we're probably just, quote, gun shy to make much of a statement or have a position on it. And if it happens, it'll be welcomed by sellers, but I just don't think there's a lot of enthusiasm to try to anticipate that number will have a lot of positive impact on the market, but we'll see.
Lastly here, Dan, you have pulled together information on the economics of ethanol production, and of course that would reflect on the feed grain trades, how that reads. So what are those returns to ethanol looking like right now?
The ethanol plants themselves have had, on the one hand, lower or just so-so corn input price situation, so that you would think coming into this would be positive for profits. But the challenge for them is that the ethanol price itself has fallen off. And again, as the overall economy's had worries about how the coronavirus may affect, consumer goods, driving, vacations, whatever, you've tended to see the energy sector weaken, and ethanol is caught up in that. So by our estimate, The February cost of production for ethanol was about $1.49 a gallon, and the actual price was $1.25. So, gosh, that 15-20 cent drop that we'd seen in ethanol prices here in the last several weeks was a big thing. So you're looking at about a 25-cent loss per gallon in February, and that would be about the same as the losses that they'd had in January. They had a period in October, November where things were looking pretty good, at least near break even. But here, after the first of the year, they've been struggling. For biodiesel, really kind of a surprising situation. The cost is estimated to be about $2.90 per gallon biodiesel, and again, that's calculated in our modeling by using soybean oil prices. So as those have fallen off a little bit, you've seen the biodiesel price actually stay up decently. Here, where ethanol had fallen, biodiesel had held up decently, and with that, you've got an estimate of about 18 cent a gallon increase or improvement or profit in biodiesel plant production. So anyway, interesting to look at those, and we do hear from the ethanol industry that there are some plant closures, some slowdowns, etc. There's some restructuring that's happening, but yet when you look around the countryside, we see these strong basis levels at ethanol plants, at local elevators. So that's probably the best indicator that gosh, there's some business happening in that sector, and I guess farmers that are selling feed grains can really be thankful for that sector continuing to stay strong and to be supportive of local prices.
Well, the market scene has become ultra-eventful with the coronavirus and other factors at play, and we invite folks to check out your notes on the agmanager.info website, keeping up on all of this affecting our grain markets. Dan, we appreciate it. We'll talk again next Friday.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Our weekly visit with grain market economist Dan O'Brien of K-State Research and Extension, along with us from his office in Colby, Northwest Kansas. And we'll be back with more in a moment on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today. Spring wheat production in Kansas. It's drawing more interest, our guest tells us now, and we'll ask why and what goes into raising spring wheat successfully here in winter wheat country. Lucas Haag is with us via phone. Lucas, as you know, is the Research and Extension Crop Production Specialist in Northwest Kansas for K-State. This is a crop, Lucas, that historically has been largely ignored in Kansas, spring wheat. What has prompted this interest of late that you've been observing?
Well, Eric, like a lot of our decisions on farm, it's really economics is driving a large part of this. We've got producers that recognize the value of wheat in our rotations. Having that wheat stubble is so important to our no-till dryland row crop production out here. But we're looking, most guys are looking at the economics of summer fallow winter wheat, and that's just not paying the bills. And so, the ability to maybe put a spring wheat in, go in and no-till that into, last fall's row crop stocks and raise a wheat crop in short order, and then we got that stubble again that we could plant row crop into back into the spring of 21 without the associated fallow costs. And so it's purely an economic play on the cost side, but then there's also some opportunities maybe on the revenue side as well.
Right out, you say, though, quality of crop is of the essence here from the marketing vantage point.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Eric, because, we think about the flip side of this is, there's a potential opportunity because some of our flour mills in Kansas do, in fact, bring spring wheat down from the Dakotas. often used in a blend to improve the quality, oftentimes taking our, marginal or average quality hard red winter and then blending that with hard spring out of the Dakotas to raise the quality of that flour. So obviously, you could look at that and say, well, there's an opportunity because, we'd have an obvious freight advantage over bringing wheat down out of the Dakotas. But all that hinges on quality. The quality standards for spring wheat are much more stringent than what our winter wheat producers are accustomed to in terms of protein, in terms of falling numbers, in terms of mill and bake quality. And so it's a very different game in that respect in terms of how much the quality of this wheat is going to affect its marketability. And I think we've got some real challenges in terms of consistently raising quality in our environment.
Well, in order to achieve that quality necessary to make this an advantageous crop for producers, what do they need to think about here? Let's get into the agronomics, starting with planting date.
Yeah, so from a planting date standpoint, really any time now through, maybe about the third week of March or so, third or maybe even into the fourth week of March is probably about as far as March 15, March 20 would, I think, be the latest that we would want to push that. And the reasoning for that is, and the overall reason spring wheat does not yield as well as winter wheat in Kansas is because what we're fighting against is heat during the grain fill stage. And so if you think about, spring planted wheat and when it's going to be going through hit and boot and heading and grain fill, that's all going to be, quite a bit later than our winter wheat, which is going to make it more exposed to heat stress. And so that's typically why we see lower yields with spring wheat. So planting date's really critical from that standpoint.
Variety selection. This is unfamiliar territory for producers in this area, so where does one start there?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did some variety trials at Colby here this last year. We looked at 16 different spring wheats. They ranged in yield from a low of 37 to a high of 56 bushels. So we do see a range of yield potentials there. We've only got 1 year of data, and so we're not at the point where we can make any variety recommendations. But certainly, a lot of the same players in the hard red market in terms of seed also have some offerings in the spring market. So we do intend on having variety trials out again this year, and that'll give us 2 years of data, and hopefully we can start picking apart some varieties that may be better adapted. Obviously, not just from a yield standpoint, but we're running all these through full mill and bakes and looking at the quality parameters as well.
Such principles as seeding rate, seeding depth, do they have to be considered here as well?
So yeah, as we're seeding this spring wheat, hopefully we've got some moisture to place that into, and so oftentimes we won't have to seed as deep, and so we, could potentially shallow that up a little bit compared to what we are with winter wheat. Although we certainly don't want to put ourselves in no different than winter wheat. If we seed too shallow, we could have poor crown establishment, poor root development. Seeding rates, we need to think about. With spring planted wheat, we're not going to have that window of opportunity to tiller, and any tillers that we do get are going to be, pretty unproductive. And so, we're looking at seeding rates probably in the neighborhood of 1.3 to 1.8 million seeds per acre. And so, quite a bit higher seeding rates maybe than what we're accustomed to in our winter wheat production.
All right. Once again, though, with the onus on quality of the crop, surely one's crop fertility management, especially with respect to nitrogen, has to be accented here, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Protein on spring wheat is a really important piece of the quality picture, and so both nitrogen and sulfur, things we need to be paying attention to, and so getting a profile sample ahead of planting, and then making sure we're getting some nitrogen out there early and nitrogen available through the entire season is going to be really important. So we don't have any direct recommendations of our own, but there's been a lot of good work done at North Dakota State, and so we kind of are leaning on their experience a little bit in terms of nitrogen management. But and we know sulfur is important as well in terms of that whole protein synthesis stage.
But one generally presumes that N rate would probably exceed that for winter wheat?
Yeah, we're shooting for overall a little bit higher protein levels in general, and so for the same yield level we'd be talking more nitrogen. Now the flip side of that is, at least our data here at Colby would suggest our yield goals are probably a little bit lower than they are in winter wheat, so some of that's going to balance out a little bit.
Is placement of that N important here too, vis-a-vis winter wheat then?
Yeah, the thing I think, depending upon when we're putting that on, and this is true whether we're talking about top dressing winter wheat or putting some nitrogen on for spring wheat, obviously the sooner we can get it on, the better, because we're going to, minimize our chances for volatilization of that nitrogen. If we've got the flexibility, if we know, we don't want the ground to be frozen, obviously. We'd like to have the ground thawed, but if we can get some nitrogen out there, immediately ahead of some precipitation, that's always the best case scenario for winter or spring wheat.
And weed management, of course, is important to whatever crop you're putting out there. And in that, you'd think about weed management in the same context you would for a spring-planted row crop, to a certain extent, would you not?
Yeah, and a lot of our herbicides that are labeled for winter wheat can also be used on spring wheat. But that's a really important part of it, and it's certainly about keeping the crop clean, in season. But then also, a good herbicide program in wheat can go a long ways to keeping that stubble clean after harvest as well.
Any other management considerations that are inherent to spring wheat that producers might not be familiar with, Lucas?
Well, the key thing, I think, is to make sure you have a marketing plan lined up, have a plan to, test the quality of that spring wheat and have a marketing plan in place. Producers should be aware that it is a different market class than winter wheat. And so, basically, if you try blending off spring wheat into winter wheat, that's considered contamination and mixed class of wheat. And at that point, you basically have feed wheat, and the market for that's not real strong. And so, like any alternative crop, having oftentimes the marketing piece of it, having that plan in place is just as or maybe more important than the agronomy.
Absolutely. But in terms of the agronomic side of it, and you mentioned it, you do have 1 year's worth of field trials on spring wheat that you've conducted there in northwest Kansas. And if producers would like to learn more about the prospects of this, that data is available to them, is it not?
Yes, we've got that online in this year's Cover Your Acres proceedings, and so this year we had a variety trial, but actually we've got a history of spring wheat work at Colby. Rob Aiken, one of my colleagues here at the station, his crew evaluated it in the early 2000s for 5 years, and actually at that time the spring wheats were, when compared to a late planted winter wheat, the spring wheats were making about 50% of winter wheat. That's what we saw last year in our data. And even if you go back into some of the older records at the Colby station, basically from a yield standpoint, we see spring wheat pretty consistently making about half the yield of winter wheat. So it's really going to come down to the question of quality and being able to capture that market premium.
Before a producer commits to this, they best do their homework.
Yeah, that's always the case with any alternative crop, is do your homework, and I'd encourage folks to maybe start on the smaller end of things, get a system in place for production and marketing, and then ramp the acres up after that. And
include in your boning up on spring wheat the information out of K-State at the website northwest.ksu.edu. Check that out. Lucas, we appreciate the word on this. Many thanks to you. We'll catch up again quite soon.
Thanks, Eric.
Lucas Haag with us. He's the crop production specialist, K-State Research and Extension, based in northwest Kansas on spring wheat, something that he's receiving many questions about from producers as a cropping possibility in Kansas heading into the spring season now. Agriculture Today. We'll be back shortly with more on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, now in our 96th year of broadcast service to agriculture. Eric Atkinson here. And on to today's agricultural news headlines now, courtesy in part of DTN, with notes from the Commodity Classic in San Antonio, where the worldwide concern over coronavirus is the dominant topic. National Corn Growers Association President Kevin Ross, in talking with DTN, observed while at that classic that people and animals will always need to eat, he says, and currently biofuel consumption is primarily domestic, so he says the current direct impacts on agriculture are small, but Ross goes on to say, now there are a lot of other issues outside of that from a macroeconomic standpoint that are problematic, at least that's what the markets believe, says Ross. Concerns about the coronavirus have hammered the global markets over the past week. Agricultural commodities have felt the shock waves, of course. The U.S. soybean industry is focused on keeping their employees in the affected regions safe. That, according to the president of the American Soybean Association, Bill Gordon, but he does note it's beginning to impact supply chains. Says Gordon, we have pork sitting in ports and in freezers in China. We have pork over here we're waiting to get shipped, and there are soybeans we can't get unloaded, in his words. And the vice president of farm inputs at Rabobank, Sam Taylor, said it's taking a while for the supply chain disruptions to come into full focus. At first there was a quarantine, and then the Chinese New Year. Many people returned to their home villages for those celebrations and are just now being allowed to travel back to the cities where they live and work. Hubei province, where the outbreak originated, a large producer of finished phosphate fertilizer, and restricted travel is taking a toll on output there. The industry currently expects the production setbacks and issues to be resolved by the end of March. That's according to Taylor. In the meantime, it could create a divergence, he says, in fertilizer prices, with phosphates going up while fertilizers like urea and UAN would decline. Longer term for the inputs industry, Taylor said the coronavirus outbreak could cause companies to reconsider whether it's wise to rely so heavily on one country, perhaps sparking fertilizer production expansion in other parts of the globe. Quoting Taylor here, we don't really know how this is going to pan out. It's all under supposition that the disease is not in North America. He says if there is a domestic outbreak, the focus will then likely shift to protein demand, and that people will likely eat out less often, with proteins playing a key role in the Phase 1 trade deal with China, he says. A shift in demand would mean that we could end up with a massive glut if the disease reaches North America, and in his words, that could be really concerning. Growers will not be required to have their hemp crops for the 2020 crop year to be tested at Drug Enforcement Agency certified laboratories. That's according to USDA Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Affairs Greg Eibach. The DEA will still expect states to work with their laboratories to try to achieve certification for the 2021 crop year. But for the 2020 crop year, they're not going to require those labs to go through DEA certification. He shared that with members of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Meantime, CBD is everywhere, but more research is needed on it. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Food and Drug Administration Commissioner Stephen Hahn passed through the airport recently and noted that public demand for cannabidiol, or CBD, is high.
And there's a little store on your right, and there is a huge, and I mean huge, stand for CBD products.
He made his comments to a meeting of the National Association of State Directors of Agriculture.
We're not going to be able to say you can't use these products. I mean, that's just, even if we did, it's a fool's game to even try to approach that. But what do we need to do? We need to fill the information gaps.
He specified that more research has to be done on CBD's medical benefits.
You probably know that we approved a drug, Epidiolex, for the treatment of childhood seizure disorders, and CBD is the active ingredient in that.
He says his agency wants to help people decide what about CBD is risky and what might have medical value.
FDA has spent a lot of time looking at this. We are trying to formulate what our stance is going to be on this.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now the Kansas Wheat Scoop with Marcia Boswell. Marcia?
Knopf Farms is one of 3 new sites in the Soil Health Partnership Network, through a partnership with the National Wheat Foundation that is evaluating the impacts of diversified crop rotation and how wheat can benefit the soil and other environmental indicators. Justin Knopf, president of the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers, says we see soil health as a foundational part of the equation that we need to build resilience. Justin farms in Gypsum, Kansas, alongside his dad and brother. They grow wheat, corn, soybeans, grain sorghum, alfalfa, and triticale. They utilize multi-species cover crops between the grain crops. Wheat is an important part of the Knopf's crop rotation. Justin says it removes a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stores it first in the residue and then in the soil. Also, as a high carbon residue, it gives us good protection on top of our soil. It's important to us to be growing a mix of crops that are both summer annuals and winter annuals to have increased diversity in our cropping system. Growing wheat also helps spread the risk. He said our weather is really unpredictable. We know here in Kansas that we're going to be limited by water at some point through the year, although 2019 was an exception with the extreme amount of rainfall we received. Growing a winter annual within our crop mix helps spread our weather risk, making our cropping system more diverse and therefore more resilient. Knopf will be conducting an enhanced practice trial on their plot over the next 5 years, with a cover crop trial that will consist of adding a cover crop to any open window between grain crops is compared with the same system with no cover crops. He says the enhanced practice will have continuous living roots in the cropping system. So anytime we harvest a grain crop, we will shortly thereafter be going back through and seeding either a cover crop or the next grain crop. This research will allow Knopf to compare how extending the growing season with cover crops and how maintaining living roots in their soils for a longer period of time each year affects their unique crop rotation. At the end of the trial, Knopf has 3 factors he would like to use to measure success. He says, I would want to see that we've increased our soil carbon over these 5 years, which means we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I consider it to be the energy currency of the biological system. So the more carbon we have in our soils, the better they will be functioning in general. Knopf would also find the practice successful if a more robust and diverse biological population was present through an increased earthworm count and higher fungi to bacterial ratio recorded. He hopes to see physical soil characteristics improved as well through increased soil aggregation and higher aggregate stability. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and this is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
To cap off this Agriculture Today, it's a glance once more to Kansas agricultural weather with the good help of climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll attribute this description to you, Mary. You call it a wacky weather week in Kansas.
It was a very wild week as far as Kansas weather goes. We actually made national news for one event that fell outside of our normal period for our weekly summary, and that was that streak of very heavy snow that was in north central and central Kansas. Snowfall amounts in excess of 13 inches in locations. What was unusual about it was that it was a very narrow band of snow, and we're talking less than 10 miles in some locations, and the widest may have been something like 13 miles, but it was very visible from satellite, and a number of flights over the area also captured that. We typically don't have a persistent snowpack, so that 13 inches stood out literally like a sore thumb. And
it made the rounds on social media.
It made the rounds on social media and even in some of the national newspapers where they were talking about a hyper-local event. Not necessarily an appropriate term, but it was one that captured the media attention. It should be noted that we do have those streaks of heavier precipitation on a fairly regular basis embedded in storm systems. What was different about this one was, of course, the fact that it was snow, and it was snow over bare ground, which made it highly visible. If we had already had a snowpack on the ground, the 13 inches wouldn't have been nearly so readily discernible. Of more note to our local producers is that this was on the heels of an earlier system over the weekend that produced very heavy rains across the state, and that resulted in some improving conditions in our drought monitor. Mm-hmm. We saw the heaviest rainfall across the central areas of the state and the southern divisions, so completely eliminated any shape of form of abnormally dry or drought in the central area, and in fact went to flooding conditions in parts of southern Ellsworth, northern Reno County. Basically, Cow Creek was the area that was impacted by it. The North Central Division was actually a little bit below normal for the period. They only had 87% of normal. Northeast didn't fare much better. We averaged 103% of normal. And Northwest had a corner up in the far northwest corner of Cheyenne County that got a little bit more, and their divisional average was 182% of normal. In contrast, West Central had about 7 times their normal precip. They averaged 1.31 inches. So, again, a fairly significant rain event in that region.
You say, Mary, that in fact things are shaping up to the point where the National Weather Service has issued a flood outlook for Kansas. And in fact, we might see that kind of activity with some regularity this spring.
Right. The National Flood Outlook was released yesterday, and that included, of course, Kansas. For us, the conditions are not nearly so threatening as they were last year at this time, but we still have very saturated soils across the state. We have very high river levels across the state, and we have fairly high reservoirs, particularly in the eastern third of the state. All of that combines to increase the risk of flooding. Again, we could have typical rainfall in the spring, and we usually have at least some flooding. This is just going to enhance that possibility of that. Areas that are of particular risk, southeast Kansas is one that's going to have face a lot of trials this spring. They've been wet all winter. They really have a lot of moisture to deal with already. If they get their normal rainfall, it's just going to aggravate the situation. Another area of concern will be along the Missouri River in northeastern Kansas. Further west in northeastern Kansas, you think along the Republican River and Blue River, again, high levels of moisture to our north, which will mean runoff levels can be fairly elevated, and that could create problems on those tributaries.
We will watch and see how this unfolds, but that potential is there. Mary, the month of March is right around the bend. What does the forecast tell us?
Well, the outlook for March is for a slight chance for cooler than normal temperatures. That does not mean we're not going to see the same roller coaster that we've experienced in February, where we have a very nice, mild couple of days, and then it goes over the cliff and drops off to the extremely cold. That kind of roller coaster pattern is likely to continue. We just may have a little bit deeper valleys in the cold temperatures than we have highs in the warm. Keep in mind that we're going into the spring. Our average temperatures are normally getting warmer, so what would have been a warmer than normal day in February could be slightly on the cooler side in March, and that's just the nature as we move into our warmer seasons. On the moisture side, it's equally likely to be above or below normal, with the exception of the extreme eastern borders of Kansas along the Missouri and Nebraska borders. That is favoring a slight trend towards drier than normal. Again, given the saturated conditions in those areas, a slightly drier than normal March would not be a negative. It could actually be beneficial. Again, it depends upon how it's distributed. If we get all of the moisture in a single storm, it could create problems any way you look at it.
But for the more immediate, it appears that we'll have a decent weekend coming up.
Right. The weekend outlook is for mild temperatures. We'll have a cool down as we go into the week, but it looks to be, again, mainly on the dry side. The quantitative precip forecast is generally calling for less than 1/100 of an inch in all except the extreme northwest and the extreme southeast. A lot of moisture is going through to our south through Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and southern Missouri, and it's going to clip the southeast corner of Kansas.
Very well. Thanks for coming over and passing along the information. We'll catch up with you again next Friday.
Thanks, Eric, and everybody enjoy their weekend, I hope.
You as well. Mary Knapp with us from the Weather Data Library here at K-State, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. And we thank you as well for being along with us. Please be back with us right here on Monday. Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.